Welcome back for part 2. Charles Taylor's essay on self-interpreting animals was written quite a while ago. So if we want to understand the contemporary scientific research about emotions, I think we should look to the work of Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett. Professor Barrett is a professor of philosophy at Northeastern University. She is the director of the Affective Science Laboratory. She has an appointment at Harvard Medical School. She's the chief science officer at the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior at Mass General. She's the co-founder of the journal Emotion Review. She's the co-founder of the Society of Affective Science. Deep breath, there's more. She's the former president of the American Psychological Association. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada because she's Canadian. And she's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Scientists because we let in Canadians. She's also one of the top 1% of all cited scientists in the world. So let's look at what Lisa Feldman Barrett has to say about the nature of emotions. Sometimes the best way to access somebody's views is to understand what views they're rejecting. And in the case of Professor Barrett, she's taken on one of the standard views in the psychological literature of emotions. So let's look at the classical theory of emotions, the theory of emotions that Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett is arguing against, and also get an idea of what she sees as wrong with it. Now, the classical theory of emotions, I also refer to it as the inside-out theory of emotions, because the classical theory of emotions stipulates that there are 6 or so, there's different versions, but basically 6 universal emotions that you find across the species. So we're not talking about things like schadenfreude or an elaborate joy at somebody else's unfortunate events in their lives. We're not talking about ennui, a kind of deep existential lethargy. We're not talking about chrysalism. This is a real emotion. It is the emotion you feel when you feel comforted inside of a house, looking at a rainstorm outside the house as if you're in a chrysalis. Or forlornness, this sad sense of hopelessness. Or sisu is a Finnish emotion that has to do with the idea of perseverance in the face of an obstacle. We're not dealing with any of those very complicated, culturally elaborate emotions. We're just talking about 6 basic emotions: joy, sadness, fear, disgust, anger. You see why I call this the inside-out theory of emotions. Oh, there were 6. There's only 5 there. Well, there's also surprise. I guess that one didn't make it into the movie. That got left on the cutting room floor. So those 6 emotions are understood to be the basic emotions in this universal theory, the classical theory of emotions, and are thought to be reflected worldwide. The way they test this is called the basic emotion method. And there's different versions of it, but it amounts to the same thing. The idea is this, that every emotion has a distinctive expression. So this is the second part of the classical theory, that there are basic universal emotions and that each individual emotion has a distinctive biological, physiological expression. So joy has a big happy smile, sadness, a sad frown, fear, right, a kind of wide eyes and open mouth, anger, the furrowed brow, and disgust, a kind of sneer, kind of something smells bad. So those are the basic expressions. In fact, here you have some of the actual images that are used. It's an actor who is supposed to be especially good at making these kinds of faces that are used for these sorts of experiments. Same emotions: happiness, joy, sadness, fear, anger, disgust. This goes back to Darwin. Darwin had sketches in his books. He thought there was an evolutionary movement toward biological expressions of emotion that allowed humans to communicate emotions to other people. And these were standardized emotions. And if we can draw them carefully, we can understand the way these are universal across the species. So the way the tests work, the way they would do these sorts of studies is you go to different cultures, different places of the world. Perhaps you show them a face like this, and then you ask, what is the emotion this face conveys? Is it anger, joy, fear, sadness, disgust? And then the person would answer the question. In this case, it's supposed to be sadness. And if they do, then that gives you the expected result. That is one of the main ways in which this test would go globally to different people across the planet. There's another way they would do the test, and that is they would give them a situation and tell them the emotion that connects to the situation. A woman's mother has died and she feels sad. And then they show the pictures of the faces and say, here are some faces. Each face expresses an emotion. Which face reflects the person's face in this scenario? And ideally, they'd pick out the sad face. Now, if this is done right and done well, you get 85% accuracy. 85% in Western countries. You get people hitting the expected emotional correlation between the words and the image. In non-Western countries, it's lower because there are cultural differences in the way the emotions are expressed. But you get a tremendous amount of replicability, which you often don't get in psychology, and consistency globally. But what happens if you remove the word prompts from these experiments? So what happens if you just ask, what is this person feeling? And you don't give them the list. Anger, disgust, surprise, sadness, joy. What we find in these cases is that only 58% instead of 85% give the expected answer. It drops significantly. And if you set up the test so that no words are involved, they're not asking about to give a word to a face or give a face to a word. They're just simply looking at two faces, and you say, are the people feeling the same thing? Only 42%, less than half, give the expected answer. Now, it may be that in these cases, I'll go back one, in these cases, the person is looking at the person on the left and saying, oh, that looks maybe like disgust. And they look at the person on the right. Is that disgust? Sleepiness? What is that emotion that the person is expressing there? Right? But they're still using words and concepts to answer the question. So what they do is they have a way of short-circuiting the way your mind uses concepts. And here's what they do. They have the test subject repeat an emotion term over and over again until it becomes just a meaningless sound to them. They say anger, 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 anger for a minute. And after a while, your brain just stops associating that word with that meaning. And then they give them the test again, and now it is down to 36% give the expected answer. Almost down to only a third of the people tested give the expected answer when you short circuit the way the concepts are working in your brain. This really shows that in recognition of emotions, concepts are playing a central role. The words in these tests are doing a lot of work in priming the answers for the people they are testing. And so maybe it's not the case that there are universal emotions that we all just naturally recognize, but maybe it's the case that the words playing this priming role help us to identify things, not because we just see sadness, but because we know the word sadness and understand the kinds of associations that we associate with the word sadness. They went further in these tests. They started to test people who have semantic dementia, so they've lost their capacity to speak. And they've tested it in young children before the concepts have sort of crystallized into the way that they're used with adults. And they find in both of these cases, they can often identify a face and a word, but if you ask them about two faces, they can't do it. So here seems fairly definitive evidence that words and concepts are playing a structuring role in the way we perceive emotions. So much so that you start to wonder if there are universal emotions at all, or universal recognitions of emotions. I should say the examples that I drew from, the image examples I drew from, are from an article that was published just last year. And what that article argues is that when you look at all these different studies and the way that the actors in the studies represented facial expressions of emotion, even though the emotions were supposed to be the same emotions: fear, disgust, anger, joy, happiness, and there'll be some more subtle ones as well. What they found is only in the case of surprise, happiness, and fear were there consistent expressions across the cases. They found that there was much more variability in the actors' choices of how to represent the emotion than there were consistency in the way they chose to represent the emotions. So in this case, these are 3 examples of surprise. And you can see they're quite different, even though surprise was one of the 3 areas where they detected overlap in the way it's represented by actors. Oh, I suppose we should add in there we go. Now we've got surprise, 4 different versions of surprise. And you can see that there's tremendous variety in these as well. You know, one of the ones that was supposed to work was smiling and happiness. But you know, it turns out there is no word in ancient Greek or Latin for smile. And in fact, what we find in ancient Greek and Latin culture, Roman culture, is that smiling was not a behavior that communicated happiness to people. Mary Beard wrote a whole book about laughter in ancient Rome because Mary Beard is amazing. And here's what she said in this book. She says, "This is not to say that the Romans never curled up the edges of their mouths in a formation that would look to us much like a smile." Well, of course they did. But such curling did not mean very much in the range of significant social and cultural gestures in Rome. In fact, what you find is smiling as an expression of joy or happiness did not really emerge until the late Middle Ages. And the big smile where you show your teeth, did not really emerge until the 18th century with the advent of real dental work. So for example, Mona Lisa, that was a very typical smile. And in fact, it was in the 17th century when the Mona Lisa was painted. If you showed your teeth, that was seen as gauche and sort of low class. So if there was a painting from the 17th century, like the one on the far side here, that is a painting of a prostitute. And part of how you know it's a prostitute is her big toothy smile. Right? It's not until the 20th century that you start to see paintings, and even then not so common, paintings and portraits of people who actually have a full toothy smile. This one is from Picasso, one of the very early ones from 1901. So even this gesture of smiling and having a smile associated with happiness, which is one of the consistent things the researchers found, is itself a historical occurrence and not something that is culturally universal. It turns out the studies show that only 30% of feelings of anger are expressed as frowns. Now 30%, that's nothing to frown at, right? That's actually a significant result. But it means that 70% of the time when people are feeling anger, they are expressing their anger physically in different ways than frowning. So let's look at a short video by Lisa Feldman Barrett that gives a really clear example of the problems of thinking that there are basic human emotions that have basic biological expressions.
How good do you think you are at detecting emotion? One challenge comes from the fact that the same exact face can be used in different emotions. We might be screaming in disgust, screaming in fear, screaming in celebration, screaming from happiness, or screaming from frustration. Same face, different emotions. Another challenge is that the same emotion can have many faces. When we're happy, we laugh, cry, smile, scream, have all kinds of facial expressions.
Okay, so what should we take from that video? The first thing we should take is that context influences emotion perception. The same expression, the same behavior means very different things given the context. And that means that many of the studies where they ask people to identify emotions done in a context-neutral setting may not be the best way to understand the way the emotions get expressed. Second, we should understand that emotion classification and perception is informed by concepts. And remember, this is what Charles Taylor was arguing at the end of his article. That was his main point. Emotions are not some pure biological root which has a character independent of our interpretations of the world, independent of the way we understand ourselves, independent of our language and concepts, but on the contrary, emotions themselves are shaped by language. Emotions themselves are a kind of interpretation, effective interpretation of the world. And then finally, Lisa Feldman Barrett's research converges with what Taylor argues, and that is that concepts are shaped by language, so emotion too is shaped by language. Lisa Feldman Barrett also agrees with Charles Taylor that emotions belong to the category of social reality, like money, like colors. And this is not just the view that you can't have a thought without a thinker, that you can't have an emotion without an emoter. The idea is that the very nature of an emotion is socially shaped. So there are the obvious examples that we saw with Taylor, for example, like shame. Shame itself is evidence of a kind of community of standards as which you are recognizing yourself as fitting in or not fitting in. That emotion could not exist were it not for the idea that you belong to a certain community. Not only are emotions social, but emotions are dialogical. And the difference is, it's one thing to say that you're shaped by a community. You are also shaped by the individual interactions you have with other people. So, for example, you may belong to a culture where certain sorts of behaviors are internalized to trigger shame, or to certain situations are internalized to trigger fear. But it also might be the case that as you interact with specific other people, because of those interactions, those dialogical interactions, you don't experience shame in those situations, or you don't experience fear in those situations. Of course, it could work the other way too. By the very nature of the dialogical interactions with other people, they can become triggers for shame or fear where they wouldn't be otherwise. This is important because both Fricker and Gadamer want to emphasize the importance of virtuous dialogue as a way to overcome certain kinds of injustices. That is, by the very way in which we interact with other people, right, we create and make possible certain kinds of emotional opennesses, certain kinds of emotional awarenesses that might go against the ways in which we've been socialized, and that might make certain sorts of experiences and certain sorts of realizations possible. In addition, we find in certain mindfulness practices the use of language to help to modify and control our emotional responses to situations. For example, reframing is a way in which we can use language to recast what is happening to us in order to recalibrate our emotional responses, right? To allow ourselves to be more emotionally in control of our lives. Another example of this is the phrase that to name it is to tame it, right? To find the words for what we are feeling then helps us better understand what is going on and respond to what is going on with us, and to keep these feelings from having a certain sort of control over us and our behavior in ways in which are not welcome, are not constructive for us. And the reason these work so well is precisely this very idea that our emotional life is richly shot through with language and interpretations. So transforming the language is also a way to transform our emotional lives, hopefully for the better. So Feldman Barrett agrees with Taylor. Emotions belong to social reality. They're socially shaped. They are dialogically shaped. They are interpersonal and social to the core. Moreover, although Taylor tended not to consider pain as belonging to the same category, we know that it works similarly with the case of pain. Pain functions differently in different situations and is experienced differently in different situations by different people. There's a great study which looked at people who were bilingual. Right? In this case, they're both English and Spanish speakers, but they tended to identify with more either English culture or Spanish-speaking culture. And then what they would do is they would cause these people to feel pain by warming their forearms, right? And for a certain group, they would talk to them as they did this in English. Another group, they talked to them as they do this in Spanish, and they'd have them describe their feelings in English or Spanish. What happened was the people, the people who identified with English language and then were reporting their experiences in English reported feeling the pain more strongly than they did when they talked about their feelings in Spanish. And likewise for the Spanish speakers, when they were articulating their feelings in the language that they most identified with, they also felt the pain more acutely. Right? It shows that there is a connection between language and the way we talk about our experiences and the way we feel our experiences, even at the level of pain. I can give the example of my father, who's had some strokes lately, and as a result, he now is in this situation where he expresses pain, and then you ask him, or a nurse will ask him, or a doctor will ask him, "Are you in pain?" And his answer is pretty much always, "I don't know," which is an odd answer. You usually would think you know you're in pain or not, but he'd answer, "I don't know." And he still does this. And if you ask him, though, "Does your leg hurt?" "No." "Does your shoulder hurt?" "No." "Does your hand hurt?" "Yes." All right? When the words are specific to the part of the body, then he is able to be aware of the pain that is occurring in his body. And even more than that, there is a greater awareness of the pain and also a greater feeling of the pain, because to be aware of the pain is also to feel the pain. So there's a connection in my father's case between the words, which shape his attention and bring things to consciousness, and the kind of pains he feels. And I'm sure there are lots of examples that people in the medical field can draw on where they can talk about the ways in which people experience pain differently. Of course, the more we experience things differently, the more they are shaped by our own experiences, the more they reflect our interpretations, even at this core level, the greater capacity there is for misunderstanding, the greater capacity there is for instances of testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice, the harder it might be for somebody to articulate and communicate what is going on with them in ways that other people might be able to grasp and understand and appreciate. That gets to one of the main consequences of the view put forward by Taylor, and I would like to say confirmed by Barrett. And that is that the language affects our experiences at a very deep level of ourselves. It affects our very emotional awareness of ourselves and the world. And this is a very sort of fundamental way in which we operate and exist in the world at this emotional level. It means that even at this emotional level, we can find ourselves being victims of testimonial injustice or hermeneutical injustice. It may be that we have a certain affect where we sense something isn't quite right? Something feels off. But without the resources to fully understand and articulate our own emotional response, we might be presented in a situation, we might find ourselves in a situation where we start to doubt our own experiences, our own feelings, our own sense that something is off. Right? And so this is one of the ways in which hermeneutical injustice can operate at a very profoundly deep level, undermining our own sense of confidence in our own effective responses to situations. And I think this actually happens quite regularly, where people, rather than realizing something is wrong, because they can't articulate what it is that is wrong, start to wonder if maybe what is wrong is with themselves. This connects to a situation that is becoming more and more discussed, and that is the situation of gaslighting. Now, gaslighting is what happens when somebody undermines somebody else's sense of their own epistemic status. That is, they start to question their own judgments and question their own feelings as a result of somebody else. And usually that is not thought of as a hermeneutical injustice, but closer to a testimonial injustice, or maybe a different category of epistemic injustice altogether. But we can see the way that this can operate because language affects us so deeply. We can see the way in which it provides sort of a vehicle for the effectiveness of gaslighting. I'd like to play the opening of Charlotte Perkett Gilman's short story, Yellow Wallpaper. This essay is a classic story, an example of gaslighting. And I think what you'll see, or what you'll hear as you listen to this, is different examples of epistemic injustice at work.
It is very seldom that mere ordinary people, like John and myself, secure ancestral halls for the summer. A colonial mansion, a hereditary estate, I would say a haunted house, and reach the height of romantic felicity, but that would be asking too much of fate. Still, I will proudly declare that there is something queer about it. Else, why should it be let so cheaply? And why have stood so long untenanted? John laughs at me, of course, but one expects that in marriage. John is practical in the extreme. He has no patience with faith, an intense horror of superstition, and he scoffs openly at any talk of things not to be felt and seen and put down in figures. John is a physician, and perhaps, I would not say it to a living soul, of course, but this is dead paper and a great relief to my mind. Perhaps that is one reason I do not get well faster. You see, he does not believe I am sick. And what can one do? If a physician of high standing, and one's own husband, assures friends and relatives that there is really nothing the matter with one but temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency, what is one to do? My brother is also a physician, and also of high standing, and he says the same thing. So, I take phosphates, or phosphites, whichever it is, and tonics, and journeys, and air, and exercise, and am absolutely forbidden to work until I am well again. Personally, I disagree with their ideas. Personally, I believe that congenial work, with excitement and change, would do me good. But what is one to do? I did write for a while, in spite of them, but it does exhaust me a good deal, having to be so sly about it, or else meet with heavy opposition. I sometimes fancy that in my condition, if I had less opposition, and more society and stimulus, but John says the very worst thing I can do is to think about my condition, and I confess it always makes me feel bad. So I will let it alone and talk about the house. There is something strange about the house. I can feel it. I even said so to John one moonlight evening, but he said what I felt was a draught and shut the window. I get unreasonably angry with John sometimes. I'm sure I never used to be so sensitive. I think it is due to this nervous condition. But John says if I feel so, I shall neglect proper self-control, so I take pains to control myself, before him at least, and that makes me very tired.
Okay, so there are three things I want to highlight in that recording. The first is she's been diagnosed with hysteria, and we talked about hysteria in day one as the suspicious case of maybe not being a case of bad luck, but being a case of hermeneutical injustice. But second is the testimonial injustice that's clearly at work when her husband, who has a certain kind of authority as a doctor, and her brother, who's also a doctor, both dismiss her experiences, where she is able actually to clue into what might be causing her depression, right? Her lack of ability to work, her lack of ability to participate in society, function in creative, constructive ways. Rather, they dismiss her self-reports about her own depression as hysteria, and they argue that what she needs is not more engagement in the world, but a rest cure in this room with the yellow wallpaper. So there's an example of testimonial justice, a classic example of testimonial justice. But in addition, there's a kind of hermeneutical injustice at work as well, as she articulates her feelings about the house and her discomfort about the house. Her feelings are understood by her and by her husband as not being legitimate feelings as being simply a manifestation of her illness. Right, so that's a case in which hermeneutical injustice is operating even at the level of her own emotional responses, where on the one hand she feels like something is off, but she is willing, rather than to take that feeling seriously, rather she is willing to question that very feeling itself. At this point, I'd like to take a break. When we come back, I'd like to turn to talk about phenomenology, because the best way to understand hermeneutics as a tradition is to understand it as hermeneutic phenomenology, as a continuation of phenomenology. And I think as we look into phenomenology and a phenomenological tradition, we'll see the ways in which the themes we've been talking about for the last day and a half are explored and developed. And as we look at the ways in which hermeneutic phenomenology criticizes classical Husserlian phenomenology, we'll see the ways some of the other views that we've been stressing for the last day and a half are present in this phenomenological tradition. So take a break, rest your eyes, get away from screens for a little bit. We'll come back in 5 minutes.